Mayim Bialik is an actress, writer, and neuroscientist. Her official bio says that she's best known as Amy Farrah Fowler on The Big Bang Theory, but I hope it's okay if I say that for some of us, it's Blossom.
Yes.
I'm obviously the Blossom demographic.
Oh, I appreciate that.
She is the author of Beyond the Sling and Mayim's Vegan Table, and her latest book is Girling Up. Please welcome Mayim Bialik. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So to start things off, the book is called Girling Up, and the subtitle of the book is How to Be Strong, Smart, and Spectacular. Why those three qualities?
So the book is written for girls 10 to 18, and anyone who ever was a girl 10 to 18 or knows a girl 10 to 18. And we wanted a subtitle because it's fun to have one, you know. And there's a reason that it's not, you know, how to be saucy, sassy, and sexy. The qualities that I'm trying to support and give a voice to are those, you know, of strength and intelligence and, you know, sort of a whimsical, eccentric notion of being spectacular, which, you know, can be different things for different girls. But also kind of, you know, to speak to that as well, when we first saw ideas for covers, you know, they kind of wanted to do like, ooh, like, here's my I'm thinking, you know, like pretty headshot with glasses. And, you know, those were lovely photos. But I really said, no, I want it to look like more my personality. Like I want to be in a cape and Converse. Like, so there you go. I'm in a cape with Converse. And yeah, I mean, we really wanted it to feel not like a feminine, but, you know, I specifically said, like, it doesn't have to be pink. There's nothing biological about females that makes us want the color pink. I actually never liked the color pink and still don't. So I like that it's kind of bold and it's quirky, and, you know, we have some sciencey symbols, and yeah, it kind of feels appropriate for strength and smartness and spectacularness.
Yeah. What inspired you to write a book for girls and people who know them and have been them?
You know, it's funny because the three books that I have written, I was not inspired to write them. I was approached, and this isn't just like people, you know, being nice to celebrities, like, you should write a book. Like, I was specifically approached, like, will you write this book? And I've been asked to put my face on several books. I don't want several, I don't know, my book agent's here, so I can't lie. But enough books of like, will you be the face of this science book for girls? And, you know, it didn't really feel right because science is super broad, and you know, I know how people feel about celebrity books. I totally do, because I feel that way too, you know? Like, did they really write it? Is it authentic? Like, is it really gonna be meaningful? And this book came about because, so I have a website called Grok Nation, and I write essays about all sorts of things. And one of the things I wrote about was there was an episode of Big Bang Theory where Sheldon and Amy have coitus for the first time. And I wrote an article about what it was like to not only play a late bloomer on television, but to be a late bloomer in real life, and how, you know, both Jim and I kind of felt like, gosh, this is a really intimate moment, you know, that we're sharing with potentially millions of people. And I just wrote, you know, kind of a thoughtful, nerdy essay about, you know, some of that conflict of boundaries and where my intimate brain ends and where this character's begins. And Jill Santopolo, who's an editor at Penguin, reached out to me, and she said, I saw your article on Grok Nation, and I would like you to write a book with this kind of voice that has a notion of modesty without being religious or political. And I said, well, that's very kind, but can we do more? And so I took my inspiration actually from Natalie Angier, who's a science writer for the New York Times, and she wrote a book called Woman and Intimate Geography. And what it was actually a kind of cross-species comparison of how other mammals and other animals do things versus how women do, but it really was a full geography of being a woman. And so I said to Jill, what if I basically did a version of that about the full female experience? And instead of using other species as examples, I use other cultures in a lot of places. And because I'm trained as a scientist, I kind of go from, you know, chromosomes and hormones through sex and dating to how our brains learn, how our bodies get fed and nurtured. And because it is a book in the 21st century, how we deal with difficult things, mental health issues, eating disorders, depression, abuse, things like that. And then the final chapter is like how we make a difference in the world and encouraging young girls to think in an age-appropriate way. No one ever told me to do any of these things is also really why I decided that I should write this book. My mom didn't really talk to me about any of this stuff, body stuff, anything like that. My mom came from a very conservative religious household, and yeah, just these things weren't talked about, and I wish someone had talked to me about all of these things. So I wrote a book so that other girls can hear about these things.
Yeah, and like you said, it covers a ton.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, you said no one ever really talked to you about this stuff when you were a kid. If you could give this book to like 12-year-old Mayim, what chapter would you point her to first?
Well, there's a reason I put the chapters in the order that I did. I think starting with chapter 1 is a good place, but there's a lot.
Or I guess what did she need most?
Oh, what did she need most? Feels like it's something my therapist would ask me.
Sorry.
What 12-year-old Mayim needed most? Honestly, I think that the chapter about intimacy, which obviously includes sex and dating, which I was not ready to think about even at 16 or 17, but some of the stuff about sort of the way that we form intimate relationships with other people, even that are not romantic, would have been helpful. I included a section about how to tell if someone is not a good friend.
Yeah.
And literally, no one ever said that to me. It was just like I'd come home crying and like, she said this about me, and my mother would be like, I don't know what to do, don't be friends with them, And so it really it occurred to me, what if we lay out guidelines for how people should treat each other, and the expectations you can have? And of course, it's not always going to be like that. And I already was the kid who, talked like a grown-up when I was 12. It didn't make me very popular. But no, I think that chapter ultimately would have been very helpful in terms of all kinds of, intimacy. Because intimacy those are the relationships we have with our family and with our friends. It's not just the scary ones.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Still even thinking of them as the scary
Yeah,
ones,
exactly.
right? Yeah.
I'm 41 and it's still scary.
Yeah, no, totally. Talking about the fact that when you were 12, you were already sort of talking like an adult. What was it like writing a book with all of this really big subject matter, including, science and psychology and all of this stuff, aiming it at children? Was that hard?
Yeah, I should also point out, I'd like to apologize to my publicist, Heather Bezignano. I forgot to take the Band-Aids off my pinky toes, and they are showing. So I wouldn't want anyone to look and say, like, haha, Mayim's wearing Band-Aids. I was wearing very high heels before, and my toes were hurting. And Heather, I'll take off the Band-Aids
How to wear
later.
high heels is something
I
I've
figured,
still
like,
never
you guys,
learned.
you'll understand. Like, there are Band-Aids on my pinky toes. But I didn't want someone to think, she doesn't know there's Band-Aids. I know. I'm sorry.
It's real. It's real life.
This is totally, very real right now. How did it feel? It was difficult. I'm a person who loves words. I love language. I remember many SAT words and use them often. And I really had to write a book without my full vocabulary. I was allowed to use, or I needed to use my full intellectual and emotional vocabulary, but I had to do it with words that, that would make sense for a 10 to 18-year-old audience. And in addition, you can't just say that things are great over and over, because you can't use all of your other adjectives. It can't be like, everything's great, the brain's great, hormones are great. You have to find other ways to explain things. My 11-year-old son was my first kind of proper proofreader, and he didn't like chapter 1 at all, because there are a lot of diagrams of the woman's body. He wasn't interested in that at all. So that was not his favorite chapter. But, I really wanted just to know from him, like, does it flow? Is it interesting? Do I sound like a scolding mom? And he's like, you are a scolding mom. But objectively speaking, he said, it felt right to him, and there were things that were interesting, not those diagrams.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And you have 2 sons, right?
Yeah, 8 and 11.
Okay. So
those aren't their names, although many Hollywood people name their children things like that.
Can you talk a little bit about the decision to write a book for girls while you have sons? Are there? I'm not saying like, why didn't you write a book for your own?
Believe me, I've been asked that.
But I'm more interested in just raising sons. There are also conversations that you must have to have with them about girls and their own bodies and growing up as boys. I'm just curious how you've been thinking about that.
I've gotten this question asked in many productive ways and several unproductive ways. And in the world of social media, you see all sorts of questions like, literally, why would you write a book for girls? Why not for boys? To which I respond, well, I did. I responded to that comment. or what gives you the authority? I said, well, I'm a female. That's where we'll start. I was a girl, now I'm a woman. I chose to write this book largely because of, Jill approaching me about kind of this specific voice about being a female, and the fact that I grew up in the limelight. I was on Blossom from the time I was 14 to 19, and I started acting when I was 11. So, I grew up in some very critical years, really in the public eye, and although standards for women were different then, and there wasn't social media, and there wasn't, kind of the publicity machine directed around women in particular, I think that puts a lot of pressure on us. I definitely had a notion of being, on display, as a woman in a culture that I don't always find friendly to women. So that, I think, was, kind of part of the perspective that I wanted to bring to growing up. And, the fact is I dedicated this book to my boys because, really everything I do is as their mother. And they will meet women in their lives who, hopefully, if they haven't read this book, will have read other books that empower them and make them believe in the values of knowing more about yourself and making an impact in the world. And, people get very... certain people get very uppity, when they hear that I'm a feminist or that I'm raising feminist children, and I'm not a person who hates men. I quite like men, and I'm not raising my boys to be afraid of masculinity. I think a lot of people just literally don't know the definition that, feminism is a movement that believes in a unique role of women to break the bonds of race, class, and gender. And my sons understand that. And there is information in this book about boys' bodies as well as girls' bodies. And much of what is in this book applies to males as well as females. So yeah, I speak to my children about hormones. They know about gender fluidity because they hear it in the news, and they just, we just used to call it like mama's boyish, like why does mama like sports cars and dada doesn't? Dada likes musical theater, just cause, because everybody's different. So they've already had a lot of these conversations, but, I think it's okay for us to acknowledge that, for most of human history, women have been excluded from a lot of the workplace and have been denied a lot of the rights that men had. And it's okay to say that we want to have this kind of book. There are books for boys. There will continue to be books for boys. Men have written most of the books in human history, if you kind of look at like a bell curve of it, And I really feel like it's totally okay to also acknowledge that, the male body is very different than the female body, and the fact that the male genitalia is on the outside is a lot more informative than women's bodies where everything is, protected. And so there's a lot to know about what's going on in there. And as well, of course, there are exceptions to all of these things, but women are, a very verbal and social creature, and there's a lot that we're not encouraged to kind of talk about and bring out. And I think men are seeing that too. Men can be emotional, and we need to talk about all those things. But I also, I don't feel like one should have to defend, a special book for girls.
Yeah.
I feel like we're in a safe place here. I feel like not being attacked yet.
Yeah, yet. Just turn the page to the attack questions. So you've written 3 books, you write essays and articles and all sorts of stuff, and you're very outspoken, as we've just seen, with your...
that was just like a warm-up.
I know. Actually, I read in another interview with you that you were saying that, growing up Jewish, you were like raised in an argumentative tradition.
Yes.
I was like, yes, I feel that.
Well, if you want to get fancy, you can call it like the dialectic tradition, but, that's only in philosophy class.
As opposed to just like
being
shouting.
Jewish, right?
Yeah. When you're out to dinner with your family, it's just
right.
like, oh, over there.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. But you have a very strong and specific worldview, and, you live that in all of your life choices.
Sorry, I'm caught.
Are you okay?
Everything's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
With your Jewish faith and being vegan and all of this stuff. And I'm curious how you approached writing a book that would be inviting and accessible and helpful to girls from a wide range of backgrounds and of their own beliefs and their family's beliefs while still being true to your own.
Yeah, this is a great question because it's a great challenge, when writing this kind of thing, especially because, I was approached really because Jill, this editor at Penguin, because Jill really liked this, voice that I had, which is really one of social conservatism, which you can be socially conservative even if you're a bleeding heart liberal, I promise. It's like, here I am. But I wanted to make sure that it didn't feel like a partisan book. You know, I happen to believe in a certain kind of politics, and I happen to believe in a certain religious tradition. And, you know, one of the ways that I talk about that historically people cope, you know, in the chapter on how we cope, is by, you know, structured, organized activities, some of which are religious in nature. But I really tried to kind of, at every turn, say, you know, even if this doesn't work for you, here are some of the advantages of people congregating regularly in a community setting, just to, again, sort of give information that can then be used to make decisions. And I think, you know, a lot of times you get knee-jerk reactions, or, you know, I responded in a knee-jerk fashion really for much of these years. So I think being presented lots of different options is healthy. And also presenting information in a way that there are many options is helpful. But for me, you know, in the chapter on, you know, basically nutrition and what we eat and how our body is fueled by that, I do talk about my personal choices. Yes, I happen to be vegan, but I make it really clear, and it's really true. I know that being vegan is not for everyone. You know, we all know that every major medical organization says we all should eat less processed foods and less meat and less animal byproducts. But I didn't want that to be an agenda of the book. You know, I wrote a vegan cookbook, for God's sake. Like, if you want an agenda book, like, that's it, you know? But I do think, you know, it's also important, you know, to look at all aspects of these kinds of angles. And I did talk about how many young girls, and yes, some young boys as well, but many young girls are adopting a vegetarian or vegan diet as a way to lose weight. And that's actually not, you know, the purpose. I mean, yes, some people do tend to lose weight. You can also gain weight as a vegetarian or a vegan. But I made sure to also point to some of the larger issues because, you know, those are things that weren't really talked about. And it is important for us to talk about them. And it's, you know, the kind of thing that feels yucky, you know, when you hear of, you know, a friend's daughter or a niece or whatever who, you know, is having eating problems and it's being couched in eating preferences. Those are complicated things, but I really think it's healthy to get it out there. I hope that it is.
Yeah, and it's so tricky to talk about because on the one hand, any kind of restrictive eating can be a signal of something very dangerous.
But I was raised kosher, so it's like, you know, we have thousands of years of restrictions.
Right.
You know?
But I, for like when a young girl starts taking that on, it's tied in with all this other sort of baggage, but it can also, you know, I know people who've started eating vegetarian or vegan for health or sort of vague restrictive reasons, and then along the way, like discover other reasons and sort of like pack on the principles as you go.
Yeah, that was my story as well. So yeah.
But back to I guess the sort of the conservatism, the idea of being sort of conservative while also bleeding heart liberal. You mentioned modesty earlier, and one of the things that really intrigued me in the book actually was your mention of modesty in the acknowledgments. You thank two women who I think are both rabbis, right?
Remind me.
I didn't write their names down.
Is it Wendy Shalit? Wendy Shalit wrote A Return to Modesty.
It was.
Pretty sure I acknowledged her.
Hold on.
This is fun.
Tell us who she is while I look this up.
Well, Wendy Shalit is an author who wrote Return to Modesty. She's not a rabbi. But she wrote a book about sort of the reclaiming that a lot of women are doing, not necessarily in a religious manner, but to reclaim the notions of having choices, you know, about what they wear and how they wear it. Did you find it?
I did find it. So I think you mentioned.
Close? I think Wendy Shalit is mentioned in the chapter.
Right.
Here it comes.
And so here it was Aviva Cole and Allison Josephs.
Both of whom are not rabbis. This is why I wasn't sounding familiar. Allison Josephs is an online presence. She goes by Jew in the City.
Yeah.
She was actually, I met her through Partners in Torah, which is a free organization that sets you up with someone who can teach you really anything you want to know about Judaism. And one of the main things and she's literally, I mean, I don't want to say she's just a mom, but she's not a Jewish educational professional. At that time, she and I were both new moms. She ended up kind of developing an online presence and website, educating people about modern Orthodoxy. But anyway, so that's who Allison Josephs is. And one of the things we studied through Partners in Torah was modesty and why Jewish women have rules and what the rules are for Jewish men. Aviva Cole is a Rebbitzin, which means she's married to a rabbi. And she was the woman, she was the woman that I studied with before I got married. So in traditional Jewish weddings, this may sound strange, women typically study things about being married with women, and men typically study things about being married with men. And if you've ever heard of a mikveh, which is a ritual bath, that is a spiritual and legal place that you immerse. Think of like a really holy jacuzzi. It's like that. I studied all of the rules. There are, thousands of years of tradition surrounding the use of that ritual and tradition, and it was something I've written about very publicly because I found it very, very comforting to have that as a monthly ritual. Typically, Jewish women go after their menstrual cycle ends. And it is not because we're dirty or horrible, which is what a lot of people assume, but I found it very empowering. And I do identify as a feminist who is part of the structure of patriarchy, in that I am part of a Jewish tradition, which is, patriarchal in its origins. But yeah, that was a lot. Is everyone okay? I feel like I may have hurt someone. Okay.
So the thing
you're like, what do I ask next?
Well, no, I'm going to continue the question because now I found the passage. I still have the question, which was what you write.
Then yes, this is what it's like to date me. This is literally this problem, and what just happened is what it's like.
It's not a problem.
Okay, thank you. Are we dating?
I don't know. So
the two women I thanked.
The two women you thank, and you write that they taught me the ways of decorum, modesty, and grace, and the ancient origins of these gifts have increased my concepts of worth, dignity, and the divine ability to love and be loved. I thought that was so lovely.
It is kind of lovely. I forgot that I wrote that.
But can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, I think that, you picked like one of the most intimate thank yous, besides my ex-boyfriend and my ex-husband, who are also thanked in there. Yeah, I think that for me, I came late to observance. I was not raised religious. My mother was raised Orthodox and very, very kind of old world. Her parents were immigrants. She didn't speak English in her home. They only spoke Yiddish. So she kind of raised me reform, meaning she didn't want a lot of ritual. And when I was in college, I took on more observance. And one of the things that was very empowering for me was to meet women who did not feel oppressed. And also women who didn't simply say, like, I'm part of the patriarchy, therefore I don't feel oppressed. These were intelligent, college-educated women, which you don't have to be going to college to be educated, but you know what I mean. This wasn't the stereotype of like the woman who went, got married at 17 and never saw the outside world. These are women who had lived in an integrated society and who were gorgeous, felt empowered in how they presented themselves. And I'm not going to pretend that there are many women who want to be modest and still be attractive. Honestly, Allison dresses in clothing that I would feel uncomfortable in because it's too tight, but it's very, for her, it's very modest, and it is modest by most standards. But to meet women who had fulfilling lives as women, again, within this kind of religious structure, was very comforting. And I found that the rules of, it's called family purity. It sounds better in Hebrew, I promise. But I found that the rules governing marriage and love and intimacy really protected something that I believe is very sacred. And even though I'm divorced, I think that my ex would agree. Like there were a lot of healthy boundaries, in our relationship. And when I think about, when I got pregnant, it was, after visiting a spiritual ritual bath where I had like a mystical, experience of this notion of you can be reborn, by immersing and having this experience. That's really, that's pleasant, and it's bittersweet. I don't do that anymore because I'm not married. There are people who go to the ritual bath in other non-traditional ways, but for the kind of traditional person that I am, it really felt like something sacred in the context of my marriage. And I credit those women with really helping me find beauty in something that a lot of people consider just, kind of a knee-jerk reaction, like, that's sexist, that's awful. And I also feel like there's so many things, not only in religion, but in life as well, that it's easy to sort of dismiss like that. But, I chose to make a commitment to get educated about it. And for me, it was very rewarding. I know not everyone would have that experience, and that's fine too.
We're going to open it up for questions in a minute. So if you have a question, please stand by one of the microphones. It's in the aisle. But before we go to that, so the book gives a lot of advice to girls. Suggestions. Some frameworks, some guidelines.
A little bit.
If you want, some ideas. Are there any suggestions then that you would, since you've spent so much time, sort of getting into the minds of girls between 10 and 18 and thinking about what they're going through, are there any suggestions that you would offer to the parents of girls?
Don't let your children have phones or leave the house. Does that work? That's kind of what it felt like.
You know that it doesn't.
No, I know that it doesn't. No, I think that, well, I know that, for me as a parent, I think whether I, had boys or had girls, I do put a lot, and so does my ex. We do put a lot of structure and boundaries around the kind of information our children have access to, and and knowing what they're doing. And for us, that's comforting. I think that a lot of parents, especially parents who are younger than I am, because I could easily, I'm 41, so do the math, I could easily have a 20-year-old or older. I think a lot of parents in that sort of middle generation are sometimes nervous to not be friendly or be friends with their kid, and I think there's a lot of benefit to that, and I was raised in I was raised in a house where I didn't have a lot of voice, because that's how people raised children back then. So I think that there's something in between that I would hope people find. But that being said, I think it's okay to say no. And I think it's okay to say, you're not ready for a phone, which, my 11-year-old is stomping his foot every other day at us. But I do think it's okay to say, I need your passwords. What are you doing on the computer? What are you watching? And I also think we shouldn't be afraid to upset children, because a lot of times I think I'm sometimes afraid to make decisions because I'm afraid, that they'll feel controlled or they'll be mad at me, But I think it's very important for parents to know that I hope that this book will kind of open up conversations in terms of TV time and screen time and things like that. And in terms of the sex and dating chapter, that's going to really vary by kid. I wasn't ready to learn that kind of information until much later on that, Yeah. Much later. Yep.
All right, we have a question over here.
Hi. A couple of years ago, I read an article about pedophilia culture, and it talked about things like Brazilian waxes and calling women girls. And at that time, I made the choice, I am no longer going to call women girls. And I made that choice a couple of years ago. And it's always this conscious effort. And I've gotten comfortable with it myself. And I've gotten comfortable correcting someone when they refer to me as a girl. Google girl, Bianca, and I correct them. I'm like, no, Google woman.
Right.
But what I'm not
That might be an alliteration issue, but I could be wrong. I defend your right to correct that.
What I'm not yet comfortable doing is correcting people when they refer to other women as girls. And so you just posted a video.
That's much more fun, yeah.
on social media, which I really, really appreciated. And I hear this happening all the time. I hear my colleagues referring to other Google women as girls. I hear them referring to clients or agency partners as girls, and it bugs me, but I don't know how to address it. And so I have been saying nothing, and I would like to say something, and I would like your thoughts on how to address it.
I didn't know where you were going to go with that question. I am much more relaxed right now than I was 30 seconds ago. So Bianca, was that your name?
Yes.
What Bianca's referring to is I make YouTube videos, and there's not necessarily a rhyme or reason as to why something goes viral, but we did have a video go viral for the first time. I think it has 9.6 million views or something, and it was about why we shouldn't call women girls. Then I released Science and Religion about sort of my lack of conflict therein, and that went viral the next week. We had a big month, It was a very big month. So it's funny because this is something I've been ranting about since I'm 14 years old. This is just something that's always really bothered me. And the video was originally longer because believe me, I got a lot of comments of why didn't you talk about this? What about this? What about the South in Tennessee? There's a region where men are called boys, and why? All these specific anecdotal exceptions that prove that I'm a horrible person. So anyway. But there originally was a part of that video that talked about exceptions in intimate settings, or hey girlfriend, that, things like that. But we, my creative partner and CEO Emmanuel Shalev is in charge of all edits, and he said this is what I want to do. But I think I actually hadn't thought about it in terms of pedophilia culture, that this is literally what I'll be thinking about for the rest of the day and into the evening. No, because I think that's really fascinating. I find it easier to correct other people. And I think that's really interesting, right? That we're two strong, women who like red lipstick. And, for me, I have a really hard time correcting people. And it's funny because I think I might have been on The View this morning, and I think if someone might have said, and it would never occur to me to say, like, I'm a woman. Like, I couldn't do it. But the example I give is, like, my publicist, who's here, when people say, like, she's such a great girl, that, for me, I really, and this is what I talked about in the video, I say, she's a woman, and yeah, doing it with a smile is just something that as women sometimes, helps. You don't always have to do it, but as I said, people will hate you less to your face if you smile. I think that in terms of correcting other people, that's really how I do it. And I think it's important to realize that although it should be, I think, remedied every single time, there also has to be some flexibility in how we approach things. Like, I sometimes feel like it's my job to fix the whole world, but I also have to know that I'm part of it, and I also have to function in social situations. And sometimes, and I'm not saying like, everybody wants me to strip naked at this party, I guess I should, I'm talking about being flexible in terms of there are times when I feel like, you know what? If I'm this uncomfortable and I know my convictions and I know how I want to behave, this may not be the time to do it, So I think that's important too, to give yourself a break and know that you're not solely responsible. You have celebrities like me to take a general bullet for feminists everywhere and have everyone hate on me because of it. But I commend you for correcting it, and I will try and take some inspiration for you and try and find creative ways to correct people. Maybe like a snap might be good, like, I'm a woman. No? Okay,
I didn't say anything.
Thank you. No?
Yeah, no.
Feels good now.
Yeah, it's great. We're done. Yes.
Can you talk about that other video that you did, the science and religion one? I thought it was amazing.
Oh, thank you.
It was very smart and just like really beautiful and touching at the same time. So maybe like what inspired it and what was the reaction to it?
Yeah, so I'm a scientist. I'm trained as a neuroscientist, and I'm also a person of faith. And usually the people that ask if I have conflict about that typically are not scientists and they're not religious. And I like to point out that sometimes, no insult to atheists or agnostics, but sometimes those people are more fanatical and religious about being atheist or agnostic than I am about being a religious person. And what I talked about in that video, and again, this is something I've been ranting about, for 15 years. I have never felt conflict. I've never met other Orthodox or religious people who feel conflict. I've never met a scientist who believes that the world was literally created in 6 days and then God rested on the side. Like, it's, there is a quote that my rabbi used to quote a lot, if you think that the Torah, the Old Testament is a science book, I have better science books on my shelf, Like, the Torah is an historical, religious, spiritual, mystical document. It is not meant to be a science book. And one of my favorite realizations that I had is that we can call it different things, this notion of faith, but if someone has a belief that the sun will come up tomorrow, which I would say we can mostly all agree on, to me that's the same faith as me believing that the universe is divine and things like the sun coming up happen. And the fact that when the sun comes up, I come from a religious and ethnic tradition where we thank God for that happening. For a lot of people, the way that they acknowledge that is simply to have their alarm go off and get up. And I don't have right to pass judgment on how people choose to commemorate the divine act of the sun coming up. So it's kind of like Neil deGrasse Tyson says, science is great because you don't have to believe in it for it to be true. I kind of feel that way about a mystical notion of something divine in the universe, I don't have to believe that the sun's going to come up. It's going to come up. And for me, I don't feel conflict about that. Everything I've ever learned in the scientific world has made me appreciate the divinity of the universe. I've never once said, gosh, the eye is so complicated, it had to be created by God. I don't even have to think like that. The eye is so unbelievable because it exists in the context of a universe that is ruled by physics and chemistry and all of the things that humans have to give names to. And really the same applies for religion and for God. Those are concepts that exist whether we name them or not. It doesn't matter what language you say it in. The fact that we call the number six, those are all just arbitrary linguistic classifications for things that literally exist. So Yeah, like for me, it just feels like all's good in the neighborhood of science and God.
But I like how you also related that wonder in the world to like internal.
Yeah,
Looking
I got all emotional recording it, like that was for real. Yeah, it's emotional.
Yeah, no, it is. And we do have
you.
time for one or two more questions if anyone
one
else
wants to ask
wants to
questions,
come
just
to
you
the
and
mics. Well, I have more, but yes, go ahead.
I'll ask the question. Hi, I'm Naima. Question was, how do you balance being a social conservative with being a free liberal?
I think it's funny because this is something I'm asked a lot. I think I'm not trying to be facetious. I just am, So the fact that I don't like to wear sleeveless or strapless dresses, or that I prefer that no one see me in a bathing suit, the fact that I make distinctions about the way I present myself as a woman, and that I find that empowering, to me, that is absolutely in no conflict with the fact that we should not use the death penalty. I'm 100% certain in my mind that we should not kill people. And, for me, I was raised, my parents were civil rights activists, and they were actually, they were part of the integration of the public school system here in New York, and my grandparents were immigrants. I was raised as a union supporter. Liberal values work for me all the way around. As a Jewish person, for most of Jewish history in America, we have aligned ourselves with the Democratic Party because the principles of welcoming the stranger and upholding the fallen and healing the sick is really part of what I believe my religious tradition dictates. But the fact that I don't necessarily want to see everyone's breasts and butt cheeks in my life every day, but in Los Angeles, that's kind of what it's like. If I had daughters, I would be a very conservative parent in terms of dress. When my children and I go to synagogue, much as I believe that religion shouldn't be a thing that children hate because you have to wear stuffy clothing, I do believe in a notion of decorum that way. I'm old-fashioned, that's what people say. I like domestic things. I like cooking, cleaning, and sewing. Anytime I've ever been in a romantic relationship, my favorite thing is to what kind of pie can I make? I'm just that kind of person. I also will make pie that I like as well, don't worry. No, but I think those things get kind of put in that social conservative sort of box. But someone pointed out, I was on, what show is it? Was it James Corden? Heather? I don't know if she's still here. Yeah, was it James Corden where I flashed Piers Morgan with my tatas? Okay. I was on James Corden and Piers Morgan was on, and he's someone that, I sometimes agree with but largely don't. And Susan Sarandon had just done that in memoriam thing, and Piers Morgan was super critical and felt like tweeting about how her breasts shouldn't have been hanging out. And this is a great kind of intersection of my universes, where I was really annoyed at Piers Morgan because there are definitely more important things to think about than Susan Sarandon's breasts. And would I agree that if you're doing a memoriam and I'm thinking more about your cleavage than the dead people, sure, it's awkward. But what I did is I turned my back to the camera and I flashed Piers Morgan. I was wearing a bra, there was coverage, fine. But someone pointed out, that was an intersection of my rebellious feminism. I didn't do it to the camera, I turned my back. So anyway, still not okay, I'm sure, by a lot of people's standards. But when I feel how do you combine them? You just do. And there's no hard and fast rules. Someone pulled up a picture that was taken. I did a photo shoot in Israel, and I'm wearing a sheer top. Sorry. I'm wearing a sheer top, and yes, you can see cleavage because I'm wearing whatever. I'm wearing a sheer top. And people were so quick to say, ha ha, caught you. I'm like, really? Is this the world that we live in? That people are trolling to find pictures where I violate certain notions of modesty to prove that I've never said that I do anything perfectly. But I definitely think that the death penalty should not be allowed. Thank you.
You do a perfect job of not killing people.
That's right. I perfectly don't want people to die.
Well, it's
that way. Oh, no, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes people die, it happens, but
right.
Yeah. Too soon to talk about death, apparently.
Always. But it also sounds like one of the differences is that you're not imposing your views. You're not saying that the laws of the country that should be written on your views.
I have feelings about the laws of the country.
Well,
but yes, so my laws of the country, I think, should opt for more freedom, more acceptance, more rights.
Right.
Civil rights, human rights, rights for women, rights for gays, rights for trans people. Yeah, I'm all for that. Yes, and rights for criminals and rights for murderers, because I'm an old-fashioned supporter of those kinds of rights. And if I were in politics, or if I had a Facebook page with a lot of followers, I would probably take a lot of stances, and I choose to. But I think it's very difficult. There are certain arenas where I get to say, I'm vegan, you don't have to be. However, if you want to talk about economics and the environment and our impact on the environment, then maybe we should have a conversation about vegan. We all should, and I think that's how I feel. I don't understand. I don't want to talk about, we can't talk about politics if people want to, but I literally don't understand what's happening really anymore. And I don't understand a lot of places where and how we can affect change, why I as a celebrity, why anyone should care what I think. And I understand. I have that conflict myself. Why do I do this? Why do I write? Why do I share this on a platform with millions of people? And I think I kind of decided, this is a new world. There really aren't rules for what happens when a celebrity has 2 million followers and has the power to say, if you believe in the right, for women to choose what to do with their wombs, you may want to check out Planned Parenthood or the ACLU or the Anti-Defamation League. Those are, it's a hard place to be. And I also don't want people to think that I do that cavalierly.
Yeah.
You can say cavalierly, right? Yeah. Or in a cavalier fashion.
That SAT
Sounds better.
skill's coming out again.
Oh yeah, cavalier.
I think we have one more question.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. I'm very excited to read your book, and I'm Darcy. I was curious to know more about your writing process for this book, specifically, anything about the writing process, but I was curious if you talked with girls 10 to 18 as you were writing, and also if there was anything that you thought about putting in the book that you didn't end up putting in.
That baby wants to know. This is a good question. So you asked about the writing process. What was the second thing?
If you talked with...
If I talked with... So yeah, I'm a bad student in this sense because Jill Santopolo was like, here are some teen websites that you should read to know how teens talk. I'm glad she's not here. I didn't look at them. And honestly... I don't want to say I didn't want to talk to 10 to 18-year-old girls, but in my arrogance and grandiose fashion as a writer, I really felt like I had this. And I know girls in this age range, and my son being 11, I have friends whose daughters are the same age, and so I know plenty of girls. We had a babysitter, and I watched her go from 15 to 18. But no, I'm going to be super honest. I didn't feel that it was necessary. And I don't just mean because I got a Ph.D. and in neuroscience I get to say whatever I want. I will say also, and I give credit to the women we had review the book, we had a school counselor, a neuropsychologist, a pediatrician, and an OBGYN review the book. Yeah, there were things about how I think that the pill is overprescribed for girls and that we have a crisis of the treatment of hormones in young women. That was removed from the book. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. I mentioned Ricki Lake prominently and the work that she has done to advocate for natural birth and for education about the overprescription of the pill. And I got some, where's Anthony Matero? I got some healthy pushback, not from Anthony Matero. I got some healthy pushback about that. That surprised me because I know so many young women who are put on the pill before their bodies even know what they're doing hormonally, especially girls in underserved populations where they're not getting follow-up care and no one cares because, sorry, we don't care about poor people is the message that a lot of girls get. So that I was kind of surprised about. And in terms of the writing process, so, my dad, bless his memory, was a writer. I've always been a creative writer, and I even though I got a degree in neuroscience, I minored in Hebrew and Jewish studies because it helped keep my GPA up, because I could write a really good essay. I got an A+ in the Third Reich and the Jews, because I wrote so many great essays about the Third Reich. No, but my writing skills are really more in kind of essay form. Writing a book is very, very different. And for this book, I took a piece of paper for every category of our existence, meaning, sex and dating, hormones and puberty, and then I took Post-its and I wrote questions that I would have wanted answered for each of those categories, and I wrote them on Post-its. So each piece of paper had, a dozen Post-its, and then the way that I started writing is I started answering those questions. That's literally the way the book was written. I started answering those questions and I crossed it off. There's something, I'm a list maker, I'm a Post-it lover, so this was a very gratifying experience, and pretty Sharpie different colors for each chapter. So that's what it was like, and I carried those pieces of paper around with me. I actually just finished a screenplay, and I wrote in a very similar fashion. That I did by large note cards, laid on a hotel bed, and I locked myself in a room and wrote a screenplay. But yeah, this book was very similar, and I did take time away. I'm really a person who loves the writing process. Like, I love to be literally, like, I lock myself in a hotel room, I open the door only to get French fries and green salad, and instead, like, you know, beers or like a little wine at dinner. But that's really how I wrote this book, and I went away and didn't talk to anyone, and it was great, and I just sat in a room, and that's when I was told you are a writer. When you love being in a room by yourself with a bottle of red wine and a bowl of pasta and some French fries.
And the thing you're writing.
And the thing you're writing,
Right.
yeah. No one else, just me.
Yeah. All right, well, that's all the time we have.
This was really
for
fun.
today.
Thank you,
Thank you so
everybody.
much.